As Frank said, this is the final workshop in our series, and it's on the topic of science for policy. So I'd just like to first thank the U of T SGS Events Fund for supporting this event. So a quick outline of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to start with a brief introduction and then go into 2 talks with our 10 minutes from each speaker. And then we'll have a mini panel Q&A session. We'll follow that with a case study before closing the workshop. And just a couple of housekeeping things first. Please note that this event is recorded and it will be posted to YouTube afterwards. And also, if you'd like to use the live captioning, you can do so by using the show subtitle function there. And we wish to acknowledge the history of the lands on which we are each living. Canada is home to many different Indigenous peoples, and we ask that you each take a moment to research, learn about, and reflect upon the Indigenous people whose lands you are currently on. TSPN resides in the Greater Toronto Area, and we are located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And I'll just remind everyone as well that we have a strict no harassment policy at our events. So I'll just tell you a little bit more about the Toronto Science Policy Network. We are a student-run science policy group based out of the University of Toronto. We are open to all disciplines and we're inclusive to all areas of research. We have a lot of members from a wide range of disciplines. And we aim to provide a platform for students and postdocs to learn more about and engage in science policy. So we also work with the community to advocate for evidence-based policy and to promote discussion on the science behind key policies. And we do all of this through workshops, like what you're attending today, talks, panels, and various campaigns. And so some of you attended either our first or second workshop in this Research at Work series. Many of you are attending for the first time today. So the workshop is designed to teach you about the basics of science policy and also connect with some experts in this space. And so we've been trying to answer these 3 questions. What is science policy? Where does science policy fit in with other forms of science translation? And we're encouraging you to think about where you fit into this space as well. So to define some of these things, we're working in the science policy interface. We've been using this map of science translation pathways. So we'll start here. Basically, TSPN built this map to try to kind of break down how science gets used. So we'll start, we have this pathway of scientific research being conducted to its implementation, so to it being used in some form. And a few of the main pathways that through how this occurs are shown here. So we have science being translated to 3 different groups: the scientific community itself, the public through the form of information or products and services, and to policymakers. And they each result in these 4 important things: the scientific body of knowledge, the public knowledge, technology that can be used, or policy. And in all of these cases, there's direct implementation of these things, so people actually using that evidence in various forms. We've also broken down some of the processes that are involved in all of these pathways. So the steps or the tools that may be undertaken to move from research and science to its actual practical use. And importantly, all of these 4 components of knowledge translation loop back and inform what research is conducted next. So what is known scientifically informs the next questions that can be asked. What the public is interested in or caring about also kind of contributes to what we study next. And the technology, the tools that we have available define what research can be done as well. And then this last pathway here of policy, this also informs scientific research. And this pathway here we broke down a little further because it's an important one at this science policy interface, and that's the policy for science path. So informing the way that researchers or research is conducted. So this loop at the bottom, this policy for science and science for policy loop is kind of this science policy interface. But because we have all these feedback loops involved in the map, we think, all of the different pathways here are really important to the science policy interface. And so we broke down what we thought were the 3 kind of key areas to touch on. And this became the 3 parts of our workshop series. So we had the first workshop a few weeks ago, which covered the topic of policy for science. Last week, we had our second workshop called Science in the Public. So that was sort of focusing on the science communication with the public piece. And our final workshop today, workshop 3, is focusing on that science for policy pathway. So just to break that down a little further, the processes that we've included here that may be involved in translating science to policymakers is either through science advice or science advocacy. So science advice is generally sought out advice from experts to advise on issues related to policy, whereas science advocacy kind of more describes that push for evidence on specific topics to be used to inform policy. So this sought out expert advice piece can fall into a few different categories. So here we have listed technical advice, which may be subject matter experts providing advice to department or agencies, regulatory advice, so advice that supports what the regulatory agencies are doing, deliberative advice, where maybe a panel of experts deal with kind of larger, longer standing problems, informal advice, so this would be on-demand advice given by scientists or science advisors, and then science advice in crises or emergencies, so advice that is maybe taken from multiple sources in response to an urgent issues. So our 2 speakers here with us today are going to be talking a bit more about their work in this space, and we have kind of both the academic science and government science perspectives. So with that, I will introduce our 2 speakers. We are very pleased to have with us today Dr. Meghan Azad and Dr. Elizabeth Gallarno. Dr. Azad is an associate professor of pediatrics and child health at the University of Manitoba, where she holds a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Developmental Origins of Chronic Disease. And her research program is focused on the role of infant nutrition and the microbiome in child growth, development, and resilience. Dr. Azad co-directs the new Manitoba Interdisciplinary Lactation Center and leads the new International Milk Composition Consortium. And she serves as the Deputy Director of the Child Cohort Study, a national pregnancy cohort following 3,500 children to understand how early life experiences shape lifelong health. Dr. Azad is also involved in several other councils and initiatives, and she has received numerous awards, including the International Society for Research in Human Milk and Lactation Ulrich Koldovsky Early Career Investigator Award and the International Human Milk Genomics Mid-Career Investigator Award. So thank you, Dr. Azad, for being with us today. And Dr. Elizabeth Gallarno is an internationally recognized expert on atmospheric polycyclic aromatic compounds and other toxic pollutants. And she started her career in Environment and Climate Change Canada 25 years ago as a science advisor tasked with linking science and policy for national and international programs. She subsequently transitioned to her role as research scientist after acting as principal investigator for the Integrated Atmospheric Deposition Network. And her research has received national media attention and includes ambient measurements, laboratory studies, and computer modeling. She has initiated and led national science programs such as the State of Knowledge Report on PACs in the Canadian environment, and she is principal investigator for the 2024 study of winter air pollution in Toronto. Dr. Gallarno is dedicated to advancing science for the public good and to improving communication to non-scientific audiences. So thank you both for joining us today. We are very grateful to have you here to discuss the topic of science for policy. So with that, we'll start, I think, with Dr. Azad for your short talk. So I'll pass it over to you.
Okay. These slides up here. Does that look good?
Yeah.
All right. So thank you for the invitation to participate today. I think it's really great what you all are doing, scanning your website and hearing a bit about your other workshops. I'm very impressed. So I thought I would start with a little bit about me, and then I'm going to focus on the different research projects I've done that have sort of the most direct implications for policy and some of the work I've done there. So by way of introduction, I have a PhD in biochemistry, so training in basic science. But towards the end of that degree, I wasn't really feeling it and wanted to do something more directly impactful to human populations. So I shifted in my postdoc and actually did another master's degree at the same time in epidemiology. So I have experience in both basic science and clinical research. And now in my research program as an independent investigator, I try to merge those two things in the projects that I do. And so that's the official training, but I also wanted to flag that I was a patient in a pediatric asthma study when I was much, much younger. And that's actually what sparked my interest in health research. So I bring that perspective a little bit too. And of relevance today, I think I do have training in acting. So not for many years, but as a child, I did some acting. And my mom often reminds me of this when she sees me giving science presentations. She says, "Isn't it a good thing I put you in those acting classes?" And I think that's really true, because a lot of what we're talking about in today's workshop, and I think in your previous two as well, is about communication. So you can be a really great scientist and do really great research and publish good papers, but if you can't communicate it effectively, then you're going to struggle to impact policy. And so I think that's actually quite relevant to what I do and the conversations and presentations that I give. And then what I'll tell you a little bit more about is I was fortunate to participate in a program called Science Meets Parliament, where we had a boot camp about how to speak with policymakers and parliamentarians as scientists. And I think that's been very helpful as well. In terms of my research, area of interest is around the developmental origins of health and disease. So how early life experiences and exposures can shape our lifelong health, including environmental exposures. So I'm interested to hear from Elizabeth later. And so I look at all sorts of chronic diseases, including asthma and allergy, which is where I started out, and is particularly important to populations like ours in Canada, where these allergic diseases have really exploded in prevalence in the last couple of generations. But also increasingly, I'm starting to do research in other settings, including low middle income countries, and we're looking at infant growth and stunting and the origins of that. A lot of this research focuses on infant feeding and milk composition. So I study breast milk in different populations. And this is where my basic science background comes into play, because we're analyzing the different molecules and components of breast milk. And then I study the microbiome. So how does breast milk affect these many microbes that live in and on our bodies during that critical period of early life development? Research approaches. So my work is very interdisciplinary, not only because of my own sort of dual background in basic and clinical research, but because the questions we're asking really require that. So for example, I work with nutritionists, epidemiologists, pediatricians, environmental scientists, microbiologists, and this is, I think, the most exciting part of what I do. I'm also doing research in diverse settings. So I mentioned doing research here in Canada and also in low middle income settings. So we have a large project with participating populations in Pakistan, Tanzania, and Burkina Faso. And then integrated knowledge mobilization is something I try to bring to all of my projects. Integrated meaning that we involve our knowledge users from the outset of a project. And I'll give you kind of an example of that in a few moments with our COVID research. So I mentioned the Science Meets Parliament program and said I would tell you a little bit more about that. So they've recently just had the second iteration of it. I think it's meant to be an annual program, but of course with the pandemic, that didn't quite happen. But I was part of the inaugural cohort. I think it was 2018, probably said, yeah, 2018, you can see from my tweets here. And so I was selected as one of 30 early career researchers across Canada to come to Ottawa, spend a couple days on Parliament Hill. And so you can see here that we got to meet the Minister of Science at the time, Kirsty Duncan, also the Chief Science Officer, Mona Niemer, and we also each got buddied up with a parliamentarian, so an MP or a senator, and shadowed them for a day. So I got to follow this MP, kind of sit in on some of her meetings, also rush over to Parliament to do votes on different things throughout the day. It was really eye-opening for me because I had no idea what a parliamentarian did in an average day of life. So that was a useful activity, and happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. Out of that experience, the participants, so the scientists involved, we wrote a paper together about our experience and sort of some of our reflections about the experience. We wrote this as an academic paper, so it's published in a journal called Science and Public Policy. And we also published a piece on the Conversation Canada. So I think this is one example of, you can publish an academic paper and certain people will read it, but it's also helpful to disseminate that information in different media and platforms. So the Conversation Canada was an article sort of aimed at a lay audience. And then from there, a few of us got asked to be interviewed and comment on a story in The Scientist, which is another sort of online magazine. So as an example of a project that I think is and will influence policy, a lot of my research in the past decade has been with the child cohort study. I think that's actually my connection to this network, is that one of the exec members, Maria, is working with us on this research. And so the child cohort study has been around since 2010. So it's a pregnancy cohort following around 3,500 children since before they were born, and capturing all sorts of information, so their microbiomes, their outdoor environments, indoor environments, and so on, to understand what shapes their health and disease trajectories. So this was happening long before the pandemic, but when the pandemic struck, we realized we had an opportunity with this unique study where we had a lifetime of information on the children and also a lot of information on their parents who would be experiencing the pandemic, some of them getting infected, some of them just being affected by the experience, as we all were. So we wrote a grant that was a special call from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and got funded to collect some pandemic specific information and samples. And so I led this grant. And our goals were twofold. One, to look at the direct impacts of infection on children and families, then also to look at the indirect impacts of the pandemic on mental health and well-being and so on. And we harmonized with other studies around the world. And the point of this grant was really to have rapid translation to a much greater extent than any research I've been part of before, because of course the pandemic is this very timely and rapidly evolving scenario. So to achieve that, to have this rapid translation out to knowledge users, we embedded the knowledge users in the proposal from the beginning, and we meet with them monthly throughout the project to see if we need to pivot, if we need to ask, add new or different questions. Vaccines are a good example of that. When we started out the project, it was all about who's getting infected, what are the risk factors, but then we started to collect information about vaccines as they became available. And so it was really important to have the knowledge users embedded so we could know what were the right questions to ask. We also plan to use this study to look at the long-term impacts of the pandemic in the future. So some examples from the child cohort study and what type of dissemination we've had and where I think it may impact policy is that we were featured in this report from the Children First Canada. So they took some data from the study, put it into this report, and everything I've listed on this slide has happened before we've had an official academic paper published. So we have yet to publish academically because that's a slow process, as many of you may know, but we've been really cognizant of getting results out or data out in other streams while it's still timely and relevant. So we've spoken at a few events organized by the Public Health Agency of Canada. We've provided some actual data to the National Advisory Committee on Immunization and Public Health Ontario as examples, so that our research is impacting these decisions that need to be made quickly in a way that wouldn't be possible if we were just relying on traditional academic mechanisms. Shifting gears totally, another project that I run is the Manitoba Interdisciplinary Lactation Center. And so I'll just briefly tell you that it involves 4 pillars, one of them being a database of infant feeding information, so how babies are fed, collected at their routine visits. Also a human milk biorepository where we collect samples of milk from women who are breastfeeding. And then what's really unique about this project is that both the data and the samples that we collect are linked into administrative health databases in Manitoba at the Center for Health Policy. So I underline policy there, given our focus today. And so what this allows us to do is to link information about infant feeding or about milk composition with other information about the health and social services accessed by mothers and babies, and to also then inform policy and also evaluate policies. So for example, in our province, when our last government was elected, they made some cuts to healthcare, and one of those was to get rid of the lactation consultants at the Labor and Delivery Board. Many of us who study infant feeding were horrified by this and said, that's a terrible decision. These are such important positions. And they said, well, show us the data. And at the time we didn't have it. So now that we have information about breastfeeding rates, we would be able to evaluate a policy switch like that and to show whether or not it's having an impact positively or negatively. I know I'm at my time, so I'll probably stop there. This is another example I could speak about, being involved in an evidence scan for nutrients in human milk to inform dietary recommendations by the government. Internationally, I'm involved in a United Nations committee for training and education around breastfeeding. And I could speak to, as an example of evidence informing policy, some of what's happened around breastfeeding and maternal infant separation recommendations during the pandemic. And I'll leave it there and happy to talk more during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azad, for that incredibly interesting talk. Looking forward to continuing to dive into it in the Q&A. We'll now pass it off to Dr. Elizabeth Gallarno, who will talk to us a little bit about her work.
Excellent. I'll just start by sharing my screen. And it was really interesting to hear Dr. Azad speaking and supports, I think, the idea of having more than one speaker to address a topic, because you'll see that my take is quite different and really focuses more on organizational structures that can support science policy connections. So my career path was not linear at all. I started by studying engineering, civil engineering. I got a bachelor and master's degree sort of back to back. And after my master's, I never intended to become a researcher. I did a little bit of engineering consulting, which was starting to make light bulbs go off for me, that was not going to be a good fit for the type of work that I wanted to do. And I was, after doing that consulting work, or during it, I was really involved in a year-long recruitment process through the Government of Canada called the Management Trainee Program, which was essentially seeking to take fresh graduates with graduate degrees and bring them into a program that would have them revolve through a small number of different positions over 5 years and spit out a middle manager who would have the training and experience to take on more senior leadership roles as their career progressed. And so I started out as a science advisor, my first assignment there on hazardous air pollutants, which are also known as air toxics, and then moved on to assist in the management and then take over for the principal investigator who retired and moved on to another position for a network called the Integrated Atmospheric Deposition Network, which is a Canada-US network that looks at the delivery of airborne pollutants into Great Lakes waters and ecosystems. And at this point, I realized that I didn't want to continue on a management track. So again, sort of more listening to my gut than really following any type of established career plan for myself. And I transitioned into a scientific position away from the management trainee program. And I was very fortunate in those days that the government would sometimes support students in their education. So they supported me to get my PhD at U of T in chemical engineering. And then I transitioned into the research scientist position, where I've been now for many years. And research scientists at Environment Canada are a special breed. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So I don't think it comes as much surprise to anybody that Canada's largest employer is the Federal Public Service. So at the latest count, there are over 300,000 employees. Environment Canada is a comparatively small department. Under 3% of employees who work for the federal government work at Environment Canada, although environmental issues rate quite highly with the public in terms of interest and concern. Everyone who works in the government in a non-management capacity is classified in an occupational group. And almost all of those positions are what we could call position-based. So if you work in administrative services, you will be in the AS occupational group. And if after a few years you realize that you want more of a challenge, you want to make more money and progress in your career, you need to find an open position at the level you're interested in, compete on it and win it in order to move ahead. Research scientists and a very small number of other classifications are what we call incumbent-based. So when you're hired as a research scientist, you never need to look for another position again. What you need to do instead is to demonstrate progression through a management framework for career progression. And every few years, once you have you believe that you have hit certain benchmarks of what it should be to progress from one level to the next, you put together a dossier, so much like an academic dossier in a university for progression through the professorship ranks, and that is evaluated by senior peers. And so the framework for research scientists breaks down into three major categories of work that needs to be demonstrated. The first is really the bread and butter of what scientists do: research, development, and analysis. So this is the type of work that leads to peer-reviewed publications and conference presentations and the sort of nuts and bolts work that scientists do. Secondly, what needs to be demonstrated is managing of research. So as you progress, you'll have support scientists working for you, technicians, and a group that will be assembled. You're getting funding, writing proposals, all of these things that lead to progression through management of research. And then finally, this science policy connection happens in the third category, which is what we call representation and client services. And if we break that down a little bit with some examples, representation can include speaking on behalf of the departmental mandate. So anytime a scientist goes and gives a presentation at a scientific conference, they're using slides that have the Environment Canada logo on them, and it's established that they're to be talking about their science, it's on behalf of the department. It's very clear that they're not there as independent researchers. Representation can also include speaking on behalf of the department or the government as a whole in multilateral negotiations or working groups where the scientist in question is actually representing the government. Client services is the other half of this category and includes a few different items like technology transfer. An example from my field is the R&D that's done to develop computer models for air pollution tracking, weather forecasts. The actual development and the research that goes into that development is a research activity, but transferring it into operational forecasting is considered technology transfer. It's a completely different group of people at Environment Canada who run the weather models every day and develop the weather forecasts that are disseminated to the public. Scientific liaison is another client service where we work on what we call science assessments to package research results in a way that is useful for policymakers. And finally, there are also advisory roles, so being asked to speak on expert panels or to participate in expert panels and other advisory positions also is considered client services. So when we look at connections between science and policy, I would say that in government, policy is a little bit bigger, and I would call it policy and program, where policy is more the theoretical list of principles that are being followed in a certain direction, whereas program is how those ideas are made concrete. So in the development of regulations or evaluations, that type of thing. And science and the policy and program streams in Environment Canada and other parts of the government and many organizations are quite distinct. And that's because they speak different languages. In science, it's really about peer-reviewed publications and conference presentations. You'll often hear scientists introduced at events. And one of the first things that will be said about them is how many publications they have. So that's really the one of the major markers of status in scientific work. Whereas in policy and program work, the outputs and the language that's spoken is much more about evaluations or action plans, preparation of white papers to develop policy positions, or negotiating positions for multilateral negotiations, whether, for us, whether that's between the federal government and provinces and territories, or between nation states. And the gap between the languages, between the science and the policy and program languages, can grow depending on where a researcher is working on the scientific spectrum. I would say that everybody in government research has some aspects of their research that is more fundamental and other aspects that are more policy relevant. And some of us on average tend to be closer to one end or the other of this spectrum. But the farther away you are from the policy relevant side in whatever work you're doing, the harder it can be to translate your results into a language and a format that's useful for policy and program. And that's why there has been in many different incarnations, a specific function of science assessment and application to bridge the language gap between these two communities. And to give an example of this is a project that I led very recently. It wrapped up last year. It was a science assessment about polycyclic aromatic compounds in the Canadian environment. And what we did was develop with a team of scientists from government and academia in Canada, a special issue of a scientific journal where we developed a series of related papers that broke down the chain of events of air pollution by these pollutants from their sources and emissions all the way through their behavior in the environment and finally to their exposure and effects in biota. And then we also did a bit of additional work to look at ecological risk assessment, as well as links to global change, including climate change. This is a very conventional scientific output, even though these papers were technically review papers, or many of them were. This is, the bread and butter activity of scientists, is to publish papers in scientific journals. What made this an assessment was the editorial in the journal, which gave an overview of results and knowledge gaps. And that editorial, it took some negotiating with the journal, but we were able to get them to accept us making this editorial be a peer-reviewed editorial. Often the editorial for a special issue is just a sort of short summary of the papers that are included in the special issue. But in this case, we were able to actually write an independent overview of results and knowledge gaps and word it as a plain language Q&A so that it would be useful to the policy community. It wouldn't only be speaking to the scientific community the way the papers were themselves. And the Q in that Q&A came from policy relevant science questions that we developed. And we weren't the first to develop these questions. They came based on quite a wealth of experience and expertise in the Government of Canada and Environment Canada in particular on looking at pollution issues. So these are a couple of examples of recent science assessments, one for smog, another one for mercury, where through developing these comprehensive assessments, there is a sort of process that has developed that is really useful for gathering and integrating scientific information so that it's of use to policymakers and program managers. And some of the relevant questions that, the list that we used was longer than this, but these ones are really at the core. The first is sort of do we have a problem here? Are these pollutants that we were looking at, the PACs, are they a risk to human and environmental health in Canada? And that sounds like a fairly straightforward question because these compounds are known to be toxic to both human and a variety of biota that are present in the environment. But that's not the question that is useful in a policy and program context. For policy and program, we need to know if the current levels of these compounds in the Canadian environment are posing a risk. And answering a question like that is quite different than doing a straightforward exposure set of experiments on a particular biotic endpoint. The second question is can be summarized as, well, what can we do about it? And for us in environmental science, it's often a question of determining what the impact of human activities is. So for this particular project, the question was, are human activities contributing to PACs in the Canadian environment? And again, this means more than just measuring pollutants in the atmosphere or in another environmental compartment. It means gathering information in a way that pinpoints the different sources and which ones can be controlled and which ones are out of our control, which might require adaptation rather than management. And then finally, this looping question. So it was nice to see that in the introduction here about policy relevant science questions asking, what else do we need to know? When we ask these types of questions, like the first two on this slide, we don't necessarily have the answers. There can be hundreds of studies on a particular topic, but when you pull them together, you can see that there are gaps in knowledge. There may be geographic regions that haven't been measured. There may be environmental endpoints that haven't been assessed, or there may be breaks in time records. There may have been really dense monitoring in a certain environmental compartment in previous years, but given changes in priorities or budgets, that monitoring isn't taking place anymore. And so it's a really important part of the science assessment process to ask where and to what extent do we need to improve monitoring and research. So I'll just, this is the last slide that I have, just some reflections about science policy connections, that they to be effective, they have to rely on effective knowledge translation. And knowledge translation for science is a distinct set of skills and expertise. And it requires a critical appraisal of science rather than reporting. And you will sometimes see this as scientists, we are sometimes asked to do this, and those with less experience will often write a sort of chronology of what has been studied. So they will answer a question by what has been done, but that's not what's necessary for a policy or program person. They need to know what is known. And what has been done and what is known are two separate issues. To be effective, we also need dedicated space in science-based organizations. Scientists will not automatically do science assessment, largely because they're not rewarded for it. Scientists in the federal government are promoted based on publications and collaborations and a whole host of issues that aren't necessarily about the client services of sharing information with policy and program. And a dedicated space that focuses on that kind of communication is really useful because of knowledge sharing across the different science issues. So you can have a scientist or a science assessment expert who is focused on climate change and another who is focused on smog pollution. And even though the science of what they're dealing with is very different, the approaches that they take to the synthesis and integration of scientific information and its communication can be quite common. And so the ability for them to share that knowledge can be really useful. And finally, these connections they work best when they're reciprocal. So this was mentioned earlier as well, from policy and program to science, to give an idea and inform what research directions are on the horizon from a policy scan point of view. Scientists don't always hear that and are often so focused on their scientific, their sort of niche area of expertise that they don't have a broader picture of what is on the horizon in a policy sense. And, from policy and programs should be informing career progression as well. If we are explicitly supposed to be engaging in client services, then perhaps the clients should be consulted about that. And the same is true in reverse, right? The reciprocal communication from science to policy and programs. Scientists really are uniquely positioned to identify and prioritize legacy and emerging issues. And it's not the only information that needs to be done to do that identification and prioritization, but certainly scientists are coming from a really unique vantage point in terms of especially identifying emerging issues and what may be of building concern. So I'll leave it there and look forward to any further discussion during the Q&A and case study. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both Dr. Azad and Dr. Gallarno for telling us more about the kind of work you do. So now we're just going to transition into the panel portion of the workshop, where I'll be asking both speakers to answer some questions that I think might be interesting for our audience. So to start things off, could the both of you maybe tell us how you would define evidence-based decision-making?
I can go first. Evidence-based decision-making, I mean, it's almost a buzzword that is used or a term that's used. But I think it's quite straightforward to define it, in that it draws on impartial communication of the latest knowledge that is relevant to whatever decision is being made. And so that's not only scientific. Policymakers don't only consider the science when they're making decisions. There are resource implications, employment implications, industrial implications, all sorts of things that need to be considered. But if it's to be evidence-based, it's viewed as defensible and impartial by experts in the field. And if you can't meet that burden, then it's difficult to claim that you have engaged in an evidence-based process.
Yeah, I think for me, so the example I gave when I was speaking about the lactation consultants being cut, I would say that was not an evidence-informed decision, because they had a budget cut, they needed to do something, they decided to do that without really any consultation or looking at data or numbers. I think in an ideal world, every policy decision would be made based on evidence. Of course, in reality, that's not always happening, either because there's a time crunch. So many things in the pandemic are a good example of that, or a budget crunch in this case. But so I would think that decision-making based on evidence is our ideal and what we want to strive for, and is sometimes more possible than others. But to me, it would be based on some sort of research or data collection. It doesn't have to be an academic paper that was published. We heard a lot from Elizabeth that there's many other emphasis on other kinds of data collection and analysis, but that would be how I would define it.
Yeah, I guess oftentimes we see like evidence or science prioritized that by decision makers in reactionary or in emergency situations. So like you brought up COVID, rather than something more proactive. What do you think contributes to this?
So I could start this time. I mean, when it's a crisis or an emergency, I think it's that they need to make decisions quickly. So COVID is an example of that. I guess there's room to debate like what is an emergency. In COVID, we still had to have evidence for things like vaccines. There are still trials that happened. We can't completely rush ahead, but also we needed to make concessions, we as the scientific and sort of world community, that, okay, normally maybe a trial would be done in a much larger population and have longer follow-up before the approvals will be made. But in this case, there had to be a balance between how quickly do we need things implemented versus how long can we wait. So I think that, yes, we often are reactionary, and that's necessary to an extent, but we still need to be considering evidence at the end of the day.
I mean, I think this is outside my field of expertise, but when I look at COVID, despite the rushed nature of some of the decisions that had to be made, I think it really pointed out that we had a pretty robust scientific infrastructure that we could draw on. I mean, to have vaccines developed so quickly would not have been possible if there hadn't been an ongoing long-term infrastructure in place, or the infrastructure for people to set up cohorts, to build on an existing project and, like Dr. Azad did, and propose an additional sort of add-on study based on an emergency situation. That wouldn't have been possible if that baseline child study hadn't been in place. So, I mean, I don't know if there's a solution to this. There are always going to be emergencies. I mean, if you had asked anybody 10 years ago if they could predict what this COVID situation would have looked like, I mean, I don't think people would have said you were crazy. And yet here it was. And so by having a fairly robust scientific infrastructure in place, it did allow us to respond. I think a lot of people would argue that things could have been done differently in many situations. Some could have been done more quickly or more slowly, but there was an infrastructure in place that allowed a fairly fast response.
Yeah, I think too, it's an example of where decisions are made on the best evidence at the time, and then they can shift, right? we can all probably remember at first when we were told, no, masks are not important. And then of course the evidence came out. And so now we wear masks. So things are going to change with the evidence, and that needs to be built into any system for decision making. I think too, while we couldn't have predicted sort of all the details, there were people who knew, there's going to be pandemics. What are we going to do about it? In my own field of breastfeeding and lactation, one example is that in the HIV epidemic, it was initially said or stated that HIV was not transmissible by breast milk. So there was no need to advise against it. And then it was shown that actually the virus can be, in some circumstances, transmitted through breastfeeding. And the fallout from that was enormous and rippled for decades. Donor milk banks were shut down. So Canada used to have 23 donor breast milk banks. They were all but one of them shut down during the epidemic. And today we have just a handful, even still. So there was a big sort of uprising of the breastfeeding and lactation community as soon as this pandemic hit to say, we need to find out if this virus is in milk, and we need to find out quickly, because, some hospitals were putting in practices like, well, better safe than sorry. Any mom with COVID should be separated from her baby and should not breastfeed. And you're looking at that just from the perspective that, well, just in case it's in there, we'll prevent the transmission. But you have to look at the other side and say, but if it's not in there, then we're depriving babies of breast milk, which we know is really important, and skin to skin care, and maternal mental health is going to be affected, and all of these knock-on effects. So the community banded together really quickly and was able to find the answer definitively quite quickly, that the virus is not in the milk, but in fact protective antibodies are in the milk. So we really need to be reversing any of these practices or policies that were made to separate moms from babies. So I think learning from the past emergencies and crises is important. And I think it's important now in so many areas, but thinking of mine in particular, that we have sort of a protocol in place. So when the next pandemic hits, if it's monkeypox or something else, that we immediately say, okay, here's how we figure out if the virus is in milk, and we just sort of enact this protocol right away, and it's not this big scramble like it was this time.
Yeah, those are all really great points. Do you think it's necessary to sort of create a culture both in and outside of government where science and the evidence it provides is increasingly or consistently prioritized, or do you think what we have now is kind of sufficient?
So I think there's room for improvement. The Science Meets Parliament experience really ingrained that for me. So I think, it's good that there's some degree of this, but what it really hit home for me was that most scientists do not know how to speak to politicians, and most politicians do not know how to speak to scientists, or scientists don't really understand how policy making works, and vice versa. Most policymakers don't understand how science works to a great extent. So I was looking back at my notes from that event in preparation for today, and out of the several 300 and something MPs, apparently 28 of them have some sort of science background, of which about half are actually medicine. So that leaves about a dozen or so that actually have a science background. And so with that small number, it's a pretty large minority. So I think one thing could be to have more scientists go into politics, because then they can make that bridge. And also to train more scientists to speak to policymakers. And it doesn't have to be, of course, that every parliamentarian is a scientist. That wouldn't be good. And not every scientist is going to be cut out to really have those decisions with policymakers. So, but more than is currently present, I think would be very helpful. So the types of activities that we had, can't send every scientist to Parliament Hill for 2 days, but we could probably reenact some of those activities locally to get people understanding more. How do you speak to parliamentarians? How does the process work? Because even speaking for myself, I didn't know most of that before I attended the event.
Dr. Gallarno, do you have any points to maybe add to that?
Just before I speak up, I was having trouble with the connection a couple of minutes ago. I'm just wondering if it's on my end or if it's on. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, so I have concerns when I look at the dissemination of scientific information right now. especially when I think, again, it's outside of my field, it's more to do with medicine, but how much misinformation is out there about a lot of what you could call pseudoscientific practices in medical care. I think the COVID debates around protective measures showed that there was a lot of room for improved science communication. So I don't recall that being quite so strong in previous years as it seems to be now. And I wonder about the role of a sort of decentralized media with more and more people getting news information from a variety of outlets and blogs and sources that may not be using the same types of journalistic standards or evidence standards than have been used in the past. And I can see that it's a pendulum that swings because, there also can be concerns about media concentration and that drives people to look for alternative sources of information. And so I do think this is a big concern that we as a society should be thinking about. There's just as much science being done as there has been in the past, but the information being disseminated to people doesn't seem to be as effective as it was. There's a much wider range of people's opinions about science, and I'm talking about non-scientists listening to the scientific information. And often people who don't have the scientific background to judge scientific information will have very, very strong opinions about it. And that's having public health implications and all sorts of implications. So that is something that concerns me.
Yeah, those are all very important things to consider for sure. I guess on a more optimistic note, do either of you have any examples of scientific evidence being implemented into policy to very great effect?
I'd say in my organization, it happens all the time. So, I've been there 25 years and continue to be impressed with, as much as I could call for little improvements here and there, I continue to be impressed with how strongly the scientific research arm of the organization operates and how well the information that's needed is fed into policy making. I mean, there's a host of scientific agreements or international agreements, that have been based on the science we've done. The ozone layer, stratospheric ozone depletion, which was a global crisis, is largely solved because of scientific research that was done and communicated to policymakers who got together in multilateral agreements to tackle that. So I think in this field, we've actually been quite successful at that.
I would say, the one that always comes to my mind is tobacco control. And in one sense, it's a great success. Like there was cigarettes, people didn't know they were bad. It was discovered they were very harmful. Now smoking is not allowed in indoor spaces. The downside of that is you think about how long that took. We knew that in, the 1960s, and it's taken a long time. I remember when smoking was allowed in restaurants. So that's one example. I guess it's debatable whether it happened quick enough given the solid evidence. A classic example. In my field, I mentioned a recent one in COVID with mother-baby separation, and then realizing that was not a good idea, so kind of reversing that. So that all happened quite quickly in an accelerated fashion compared to what I'm normally used to seeing in policy implementation. So that was a really nice example of things happening quite quickly. Maybe another example from birth cohort research, which is my area of expertise. A birth cohort in the UK were asked questions about how babies sleep on their back, on their stomach, and found associations of sleeping on the stomach and sudden infant death syndrome. And so based on that data, there then was a policy and a public education campaign. I guess it's not a policy, but an education campaign that there's an official recommendation, babies should sleep on their back. And so that's an example of finding the evidence first and then getting it out into the hands of the people who need it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are both really great examples. I guess increasingly we're seeing that science is being politicized, especially like in the media. Do the both of you feel that science is inherently political?
Well, science itself, I guess, shouldn't be political, but I mean, of course it is, because that's the way that science is funded for the most part, is through the government. So that's political. And that's also the way that it's going to get enacted into policy. So there's always going to be a link that will never get around, and that needs to be there, is good to be there. So yeah, is it inherently political? I'm not sure. I think that's a better question for Elizabeth.
I can maybe speak best for my field, but I think for the reason that Megan's just outlined, I think it is as well. And the way research is funded, who does research in my organization, it is still dominated by white male researchers. And we tend to be highly educated and high income when you compare to the general population. And that gives us a view of the world that is different from a large segment of the population. And as soon as you are deciding what research questions are important and how you're going to study them, if you do that from a point of view that's not representative, it's inherently political, because you are going to think that some things are more important than others. And that's not necessarily true. It can be a trend rather than being true in every single situation. And then there are the issues themselves. I was trying to think, because you had given us some suggestions of some questions that you might be asking, and I was trying to think in my own field of examples of any of the science that we do that isn't political. And I couldn't think of any examples that aren't eventually having some sort of policy relevance or program relevance. But maybe it's circular to ask that of a government researcher, because we're explicitly being paid to do work that is supposed to be relevant to some sort of government mandate. But environmental research, even that's done outside of government, is still being funded largely by public-minded funds. There isn't really a profit motive in doing environmental research, so it tends to have political ramifications anyway. So, the only examples I could come up with, there are some really fundamental research programs in the world looking at origins of the universe. There are some topics that it's a pretty far link to go to political relevance for the work that's being done. But I think the work that I do, and I would suggest the work that Megan's doing as well, is much closer to having real life political implications or public health implications.
Yeah, I think totally agree. What I would add is that I think we have to be careful of saying or only supporting research that has a clear impact on policy. We definitely need that type of research, but there are some great examples of research that seemed very basic, fundamental, with no clear impact, that have led to really important advances in science that is very relevant. And so the origins of the universe, for example, I don't know the exact details, but it was people doing that type of research that basically made the discoveries that led to Wi-Fi that we now all use every day for everything. And if they hadn't been doing that very basic research, we wouldn't have that today. And closer to my own field, there were scientists doing research on viruses that kill bacteria, and how do the bacteria defend themselves against these viruses. And they weren't bacteria that were relevant to humans at all. They were like in some deep sea vent. But by doing this research, they found, these bacteria have something called restriction enzymes that cuts up the DNA of the viruses. And then they realized how they could use this and sort of co-opt it as a technology to do gene editing that we now use to treat cancer and diabetes and all forms of other things, which is super relevant. So that's one of the campaigns in the last, say 5-10 years, that's been an uprising from scientists, has been like, we can't forget about fundamental science, because there has been some I guess, movement away from funding that type of fundamental research. And I think it's important that doesn't get totally left behind.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And there's also the advancement of technology that comes from different arms of research that end up being applicable in a whole other host of disciplines, different optical methods, spectroscopy, all types of laboratory instrumentation and measurement technology that has been developed in completely different fields, but has found relevance elsewhere. So yeah, further support for what Meghan was saying about not forgetting about fundamental research, even if it's not obvious at the time how it might be applied.
Yeah, I guess like all the points you guys mentioned about the role of the scientists, do you think that the role of the scientists providing science advice, for example, to government is mutually exclusive from advocating science or doing science advocacy?
So I think they're both very important. And maybe just to clarify, do you mean advocating for science as a field and funding science, or advocating for like specific findings of your own research?
Maybe more so the second one.
Okay. So I hosted a workshop a few years ago where I brought in researchers from around the world in different disciplines, but all interested in breastfeeding and lactation. So there were some social scientists, there were clinicians, there were people like me who study breast milk, people who study more how to support breastfeeding and social programs. So we all came together to talk about like, what are the challenges in our field? What are the next big breakthroughs that we want to work together to achieve? And one of the big sticking points and really the motivation for this workshop was the fact that in my field, there is some kind of loggerheads in this advocacy versus science. So there are people who advocate for breastfeeding and policies to support breastfeeding, and every mom should be able to breastfeed. And then there are scientists who do work about breast milk. And you'd think these people would get along. This is what I thought when I came into the field, because we all have the same goals: support mothers and babies and discover what's amazing about breast milk. But actually, and I was surprised to learn this, that I was doing research on breast milk to figure out how does it work? How is it so amazing? And these breastfeeding advocates were like the first to be criticizing me and blacklisting me from conferences, because just by studying breast milk, that to them means that I'm supporting formula companies who are going to use my research to make better formula, and formula undermines breastfeeding. And this blew my mind at first, because I thought, what? I thought you guys were my biggest fans. But it just showed me how complex that can be. And so we debated this kind of exact question. Well, should breastfeeding scientists be doing advocacy around breastfeeding, or should this be just completely separate? Do you need sort of unbiased people doing the research on the breast milk, not with this agenda to promote breastfeeding? And do the breastfeeding advocates need to just sit in their own space and advocate for breastfeeding no matter what? But I don't think either of those is ideal, because we need the advocates to be paying attention to the science, and also importantly, not overselling it, because what we find sometimes is the breastfeeding advocacy community will oversell the evidence around breastfeeding, which ultimately undermines the whole thing, because it leads the skeptics to say, okay, really? You said there's cancer curing things in breast milk? What's the actual evidence for that? And it's actually pretty weak evidence. So we want the advocates to be using the best evidence and not undermining the whole process by overselling what actually exists. So that's a bit of a complex story, but at the end of the day, I sit at the intersection of this, where I think there are some advocates that are never going to be scientists. There are lots of scientists that don't care to be advocates. But because of my dual training, I would like to be on the side of supporting breastfeeding, because I believe it's important, and understanding how to do that best and advocating for it, for policies and other programs that support breastfeeding. But I also want to do the science and advocate for the fact that if I did a study that showed that actually breastfeeding does not prevent diabetes in this case, then that's okay to publish and say, because we need the evidence. And it maybe means, okay, we focus on where it does make a difference, which is respiratory infections for babies. So I think there are some people that can do both, and they should be connected, but in a careful way.
Yeah, I in terms of providing science advice, I think that anybody who's doing that has to be very careful to wear that hat and to kind of remove everything else around them, even if they are involved in advocacy or other related activities, because I think it's really crucial that the science advice that's being given be impartial. And not only for it to be impartial, but for it to appear impartial. The users and eventual people who are hearing about the scientific evidence need to have reasonable reason to believe that it's impartial. And that it's coming from the best available evidence, that the gaps are being identified as well, that there's no pretense about everything being known, because there's no topic about which everything is known. There are uncertainties everywhere, and you know, discussions that have to happen about risks given those uncertainties. But the people providing the science advice, it really behooves them to be as impartial and clear as they can be about that impartiality. And advocacy is inherently not impartial. It's partial. It's taking a position. To advocate is taking a position. And so that doesn't mean that a certain scientist can't take part in advocacy activities, but when they're providing their information, they need to do so in a way that's cognizant of being impartial.
Yeah, that all sounds really great. Thank you so much for answering our panel questions today. We're just gonna transition into the case study portion of the workshop now. So for this next part, I'm just gonna ask one of my colleagues to share the link to the Menti website and to the case study itself. And I'll give you about 5 minutes to read over the case, and then we'll start discussions. Okay, I think that just about gives us enough time for everyone to hopefully have a chance to read over the case study. And as you can see on my screen, I've provided a link to the menti.com website because there'll be some interactive bits and bobs in the case study today. So if you would all like to go on the website provided, that would be excellent. Okay, so moving on, just to briefly summarize the case study so that everyone is on board. So here we can see that from the case study, Atlantic Tobacco Company, a multinational corporation, wants to expand its market into Africa, and currently it produces tobacco and nicoteria. Nicotarian leaders and health officials are concerned about the ongoing increase in smoking and related health issues. The evidence on e-cigarettes is a bit conflicting. So the first study shows that e-cigarettes reduce nicotine smoking, while study 2 argues that they're actually a gateway to nicotine. A local e-cigarette company called Break Free wants to license and sell locally made e-cigarettes, but this is opposed by ATC. The Nicotarian Academy of Science has been asked to advise on 2 things. Number 1 being e-cigarette safety, particularly those that are locally made versus those made by ATC. And number 2, whether to license them and under what considerations. So to start things off, I posed the question of what evidence is currently missing in this case study. So the case has briefly noted a couple of studies mentioned, but what else do you think needs to be considered? So from the link provided earlier, you can enter in your responses anonymously and it'll show up on my shared screen. If anyone has any questions or confusion about how this website works, please feel free to enter in the chat. Okay, so it looks like we have some concerns about safety differences between ATC versus break-free products, cost to public health system on a long-term scale, safety of the break-free device, details about health effects of the e-cigarettes.
Isabella, I'm not sure if maybe your screen share it has failed because we aren't being able to see the slide.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Let me try that again. Are you able to view it now?
We do see it now, yeah.
Okay, thanks for letting me know. Someone else suggested the base rate of smoking in populations in study 1 versus 2. If no one else has any other thoughts, we can move on to the next question. So to follow up on all your ideas, we can also consider whether there's a difference between the evidence provided by governments versus those by academics and those by companies. So I'd like to first direct this question to our experts. If either Dr. Azad or Dr. Galarneau have some insights they'd like to share.
I would say that this links back to what I was saying about impartiality. So, you know, a lot of academic journals will ask you to make a statement about where your funding came from if you're publishing a paper, so that, you know, some of those, there's some transparency around who has funded your research and the influence that might have on the results. You know, is a company that is advocating for a certain product that will help its market position, if it's presenting research, is somebody who's judging that information going to take it at face value with the same type of credence given to it than an academic who was funded by, say, a public health agency that has no interest in that product or the outcome of the discussion. So yes, I would say that absolutely there's a difference between the evidence provided by these different viewpoints, although there are practices that can help to make them all more impartial and more transparent.
Mm-hmm. If anyone in the audience has anything they'd like to add or to explain their response, please feel free to raise your hand in Zoom or to type your response in the chat. Okay, so moving on to the next bit. So in this case, we also need to consider the evidence that's been provided to the Academy scientists. In your opinion, is the science stronger for a particular health intervention? So to reiterate, study 1 supports e-cigarettes as a way to reduce nicotine use, whereas study 2 says they're actually a gateway to further smoking. Or do you think that the evidence as it currently stands isn't really clear enough to decide on a viewpoint? So right now, it looks like most people agree that it's quite unclear as to which health intervention might be strongest. So moving on to stakeholder considerations, who do you all think are the different stakeholders in this case? Here we have another open-ended response, so you can all anonymously fill in. Oh, Jamie has a comment in the chat. They mentioned that being totally impartial is a bit of a myth. We're all humans, we have our own biases, and a company doing its own research surely has an agenda, but so do the government and academics. Very interesting point. So it looks like the different stakeholders listed are the companies, for example, ATC, public health agencies, the government, and public health officials, as well as scientists. So one stakeholder to consider is the National Academy of Scientists, who've been asked to evaluate the evidence on e-cigarettes. What special interests or perspectives might they have that are related to this case? I'll give everyone a few seconds to answer that. So it seems like a couple of perspectives that people suggested is that the evidence isn't really clear enough for the scientists to make any firm decisions. So that might be one perspective that they might have. They also have an interest in securing funding, patents on their devices, and providing recommendations in terms of health. So moving on to the next stakeholder. So now I'm going to ask the same question for public health officials. So public health officials are interested in smoking cessation, security and safety, budget issues, and general public health and well-being. And what about politicians as stakeholders? What special interests might they have? So politicians have economic considerations, they might be lobbyists, they have an interest in the general health system, perhaps also shareholder profits. Yeah, so it looks like we have quite a varied number of interests that the politicians might hold. And finally, our final stakeholder for tobacco/cigarette companies, what interests do you think they might have? Profit being a major one. So it seems like people are mainly in agreement that it has to do with profit, shareholders, economic issues. So moving on to the discussion question, I'd like to pose a question to our experts. In your experience, or from what you've observed, how does a decision maker balance these different stakeholders' wants and needs?
Maybe before I reflect on that question, I'm interested in the last question you asked about the companies and how it was profit, 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 which of course companies want profit. But I'm a little curious, and I think about this a lot. You know, a lot of companies been out of academia. So there are lots of people who are scientists, academics who are doing their research because they want a better human health, for example. And then they developed a product, and to have an impact on the world, that product needs to get commercialized most likely. So maybe they license it to a company, maybe they start a company themselves. And I think it's easy to say, oh, companies are just all about profit. But I think companies, some of them at least, also do have a genuine interest in like improving well-being and improving the world. And I struggle with this a lot because I get approached all the time by companies, oh, would you be an advisor to us? You know, we want to make a better baby food, and we're academics and everything else. So that's maybe just something to ponder. Discussion question. So balancing these different stakeholder wants and needs. Yeah, it's certainly tricky because as we've seen through these cool Menti inputs, there are so many different, divergent, sometimes conflicting interests from the different stakeholders. I mean, I think ideally, and I'm interested in Elizabeth's answer because she's closer to this than I am, but they would be looking at all of them and trying to be impartial about it. We do have an economy in our country that needs to run, so that involves companies, so we can't just ignore companies. But we also want to be making the best decisions in terms of the interest of public health at the end of the day and not profits of companies. So yeah, I think it's a matter of remaining impartial, getting all the input and then weighing them against each other. But I'll pass it to Elizabeth.
I don't think I have any magic bullet answer, but I know that one thing that decision makers do have is the ability to play with timelines. So there can be a difference among different stakeholders and how quickly they want something done. And something that decision makers can do if they're enacting a new policy or regulation is to stagger different goals, sort of sub goals toward a final goal, which allows people who might need to make changes, say, to their industrial process or to the types of employees they have, gives them time to implement those changes while still moving towards the goal that might have been advocated for based on public health or another public type of concern.
Yeah, those are both very good points for sure. So one final question to ask everyone here. Would you say that when faced with a public health issue, do you agree or disagree that science should advocate for one particular intervention over another? Or should they remain more impartial? Well, it looks like for the most part, 4, I think that's like fairly more leaning towards strongly agree from this group. And to kind of like follow up on that, feel free to answer, anyone in the audience, just raise your hand, or either our experts as well, feel free to answer this. So as a final discussion point, what would you say whether some of the lessons learned here resonate with anything that you've experienced in your work?
Sorry, I missed that. Are you asking this of the panelists or the people on the line?
Either panelists or anyone in the audience can answer.
I mean, for me, it's been really useful to hear Meghan's point of view from, just a different field, which actually in the scope of science and science and technology is not that far from mine. We're both ultimately concerned with public health. And yet she from being from an academic point of view and being involved in different types of projects it's just been really interesting and thought-provoking to hear her perspective. So I think that supports the need for discussion and information transfer, not only among scientists, but more as a civil society activity, that we need to fight against sort of stovepiping in our own expertises and be more open-minded and more broadly informed so that we can have better input into whatever decision-making we have an influence over.
Yeah, for me, kind of likewise, it's been really great to hear from you, Elizabeth. And probably what has stuck in my mind the most is when you said, not every science question has policy relevance, and you can do like 100 studies. It doesn't mean you have the answer if the questions weren't asked in the right way or the evidence isn't collected or analyzed in the right way. And I'm at a point in my career, sort of mid-career, where I think when you start out as an academic, you're just like full speed ahead. I need to get papers, I need to get grants. And you're almost thinking of those metrics more than the impact that you want to make, unfortunately, because of the way the academic system is. So now, partly because of where I've reached, and honestly, partly because of the pandemic, which kind of put a level of quiet and no travel and reflection on me, it's like, I could keep doing that. And I've become quite successful at it, keep getting papers and grants, and by academic standards, be very successful. But would that have an impact? And I think maybe not if I just keep doing the same thing. So I'm at a point of like pivoting and thinking, okay, what are the most policy relevant questions I could ask? Because we only have so many years in our career and hours in the day, and I want to make sure that it's doing something that will make an impact. And for me, influencing policy is that impact. So it's been really great for me to hear from you today and the rest of the panel.
Yeah, thanks. I would like to just thank everyone for participating here today. That pretty much concludes our case study, I would say. If you're interested in looking at more case studies like this one, I advise going to ingsa.org. And I'll just pass things on to Frank now to give some final thoughts.
All right. Well, thank you, Isabella, for presenting that really interesting case study. And thank you to our very excellent speakers, Dr. Azad and Dr. Gallarno. Certainly learned a lot from this discussion about sort of these diverse paths that you both represent. And I think I just sort of wanted to conclude sort of overlapping again or overviewing again the broad range that we've touched on in this workshop series. So for those of you who have joined us throughout the series, we hope that you've been able to see the great diversity of positions and pathways for you that exist at the science policy interface. And we hope that we have provided with you some insights that you can use. And of course, our experts have provided to you some insights that you can use as you develop your career. Many of you, like myself, are trainees, and we hope that you found some inspiration to find your place at the science policy interface. So again, in workshop 1, we touched on policy for science, talking about how scientific research is directed by government. We did so with Dr. Mary Rose Bradley-Gill and Dr. Mashasima. We talked about science communication, science in the public in the second workshop, talking about telling difficult stories and countering when some of the wrong stories or wrong information comes out there, talking about misinformation with Amanda Buckowitz and Senator Stan Kuchar. And of course, today, we've really dived into these complex topics related to science advice and science advocacy from both an inside of government and outside of government perspective with Dr. Azad and Dr. Gallarno. So we hope that you've enjoyed. We will be posting all of these different workshops onto our YouTube channel and onto our website, and we'll be forwarding them to everybody so that they can revisit them and sort of dive in a little bit deeper. And of course, if you do have any questions about any of these topics or for any of our speakers, please feel free to direct them to us, to our email, tspn@utoronto.ca, so that we may be able to actually collect them and perhaps send them off to our speakers in the coming weeks. And of course, I would like to invite folks, if they are interested, for Research at Work 4, which is going to be a bit of an TSPN open house networking event that's going to involve some of us, some of the TSPN executives, some of the TSPN alumni who are now working in different positions in government or in funding agencies or what have you in different kinds of experiences in the science policy interface. So we hope that you might be able to join us. There will be more details posted on the Eventbrite and email. This will be likely taking place on Thursday, June 23rd at 5:30 p.m. somewhere at U of T. So this will be local. So for those of us who have joined us from outside of Toronto, we apologize. This is going to be an in-person event. But we thank everybody for participating in Research at Work. And of course, for today, we thank once again our very excellent experts of Dr. Azad and Dr. Gallarno. So thank you very much, everyone.